Welcome, everyone, to our third session in our Finding the Words series, our mental health series. Today, a very can be a heavy topic, but an important topic to be able to find the right words to share with a student or staff or a family member about grief and loss. And so we're very happy to have Dr. Hayley Watson with us today to lead us through on, how can we be of support to these students?
Thank you so much, Kathy. It's such a pleasure to be here again. I will go ahead and share my screen. And let's see here. Can you see that, or am I now not in the right mode? View. There we go.
I can see it.
You can see it, but I think hold on. Slideshow, play. There we go. Okay. Whoops. There we go. There's the perfect view. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for attending this. This is definitely a heavy topic, but it's such an important one. And when we think about grief and loss, of course, we're usually thinking about death, the loss of a loved one. And this, of course, happens to students. Very tragically, it happens to, in the lives of people that we know as well. And it also might happen in your school community, tragically. So there's sort of two contexts. One might be an individual student who's lost someone, and another context might be that, someone in the school community has passed away. And so there's multiple, a whole class who is grieving. And so we'll kind of talk to both of those as we go through. But another thing to keep in mind in this is that students also experience grief and loss when it's not over death. So sometimes there could be an absent parent. It could be that they have moved and they're grieving, the experiences they've had before. It could be that a friend has moved away. And so it's important to just, you can keep that context in terms of this applies, and grief is something that we experience whenever we lose or can't access anything or anyone that we used to have a connection to. So in terms of grief and loss, what is the mechanism? What is happening for students? So the challenge with grief is that there are many conflicting feelings. So it's not that we sometimes call it complicated grief. There's usually layers upon layers. So it's not necessarily simple. We think of sadness, obviously, but there's a lot of other things that can be going on. And the feelings are often too overwhelming and confusing for a student because there are so many different things that are happening. And we'll get into a little bit more what those feelings are a little bit later, but a lot of the time students might feel angry when they've lost someone. They might feel ashamed. They might feel guilty. They might feel lonely. There's all of these things going on. And so it's super, super confusing. And because it's such an intense experience, usually students will either, and this is true for us too, will either try to bury the feelings, so not talk about it, keep a tight lid on it, or be lost in them. So really overwhelmed and really sad. Those are usually the two patterns that occur. But both of those are an indication of just how massive and confusing the experience is for them. And the biggest challenge also with grief and loss is it makes them feel different. So this is in the case of a student who loses someone specifically versus your whole school community has lost someone. So any student who loses a parent or who loses a sibling or who experiences loss, it does make them different from their peers. It is a different experience, and it's not a usual experience. We don't usually lose people when we're young. And of course, as we know from previous sessions, anything that makes students feel different is challenging for them. So this is another layer that's part of this process. And that's why a lot of students won't want to talk about it, won't want to bring it up. So it just adds this layer of complexity when you're trying to support them. And so the thing to keep in mind, though, is that students who hide their feelings are actually most at risk. So you might think that, the student who's really upset and maybe becomes really clingy or is really overwhelmed and has to kind of sit out of classes, that might be the student that you're most concerned about. But actually, that student is processing their feelings and moving through their feelings, and that's actually a really healthy process. And there's no right or wrong way to grieve, but if we kind of look at it as in broad strokes, typically a student who has lost someone and then displays no emotion about it and seems to be totally fine, that's more of a red flag, because where are those emotions going? Because they're there, but if they're getting bottled up, what is the repercussion for that? So it's just a good thing to keep in mind, because it is part of our culture that we look at the surface level experience and then we make our judgments based on that. So it's really important to keep in mind that if a student has lost someone, there will be all of this stuff going on, whether or not we see it. So our goals in terms of how we support a student that has gone through this is to help them feel all their feelings. That's the number one goal with grief. As we talked about, there are so many layers of different feelings, and if they feel them all, then they can move through them. So, and when they feel them all, the reason why that they can move through them is because they become less confusing. So if you think of this sort of pile of feelings and all of these different experiences and not knowing how you feel about it, and often if a student feels angry or embarrassed or any of those kind of conflicting feelings about the person that they lost, they won't know that will feel challenging for them to accept that, and it's hard for them to separate that and understand that. So it's about recognizing and acknowledging all of those feelings as valid, so that we can start to pull them apart and recognize, oh, right, here's the sadness, and here's the anger, and here's the loneliness. And when they're less confusing, then we can move through them more easily. So that's the whole goal. We're trying to help these feelings pass and process. And the thing with grief, of course, and loss is it will always stay with a student. This is a profound experience if they've lost someone, and that's okay. We can't fix that and we can't control that. But what can happen is that they can start to feel more safe in their feelings. They can express their feelings. They can move through those feelings, so that while the experience remains, it's not impacting them in a negative way, because if the feelings are bottled up, then they just keep circling and impacting. So that's our goal. And so just coming back to the model of how we have these conversations with all students, we always want to start with validation. So making students feel safe, help them gently point out patterns of what's happening for them that maybe is not so helpful, help them relate to their feelings. And that whole piece is about opening the door. And then the second whole piece is about helping them take action. So helping them shift their paradigm and the way they're seeing things, helping them remember their power, and helping them practice some skills. And so just as a reminder, the whole goal of you as an educator and for all of us as adults is just to create space for students to be working through and processing this stuff. So we can't do it for them. We can't make it better, but if we can have the courage to step into these conversations and create this space for students to go through these steps themselves, this is a huge, huge asset in their healing journey. Okay, so we'll start with validation. What does it look like to validate a student who is grieving? So what we're trying to do is help them see that all their feelings are valid. And this is challenging because a lot of the times when a student has lost someone, they might be receiving messages from family or from other people that are trying to help them put a positive spin on it. This is a typical way that we as humans respond to a grieving child, because we want to make it better. So they might hear things like, she's in a better place now, or he's in a better place now. Let's honor their memory. These things there's nothing wrong with those things. These things are beautiful messages. But the challenge is if that student is not ready for that level of connection yet, if they're maybe they were angry with, maybe it was a parent. If it's a parent, there's always a complicated relationship. Maybe they didn't have a super loving, connected relationship with that parent, and so they're actually feeling angry. Then they will feel incredibly ashamed because everyone's trying to honor the passing of this person and speak of them in a really positive light, which is beautiful and wonderful. But there's been no space created for them to actually still be angry with that parent, or even if they had a great relationship, just specifically angry because they left. This is also a valid feeling. So it's really important that we are validating all of their feelings and specifically letting them know that all of those feelings are okay. And that they're not strange or awful for feeling the way they do, because remember, there's going to be all these layers, and most students will start to feel very, very guilty if they're not only experiencing, sorrow, sadness, or, a desire to connect. If they're experiencing any of those other myriad of feelings, which are very, very normal, they will feel like there's something wrong with them. And so this is really important that we validate. And we also want to let them know that it makes sense why they feel this way. We understand it. This is very helpful. And this is part of that validation. It's normal to feel angry. It's normal to feel guilty. It's normal to feel frustrated. It's normal to feel annoyed that people bring it up. It's normal to feel sad if they don't bring it up. Like, all of these things make sense. And that's what's really important for them, to help them be okay with their feelings so that they can start processing them. And of course, reminding them that they're not alone. So again, a lot of the times when a student is grieving, people don't know what to say. And so they might not say anything at all. And so for us to be the one that reaches out and specifically says, I see you in your feelings, and I'm here, that is very, very powerful. So some examples. So simply saying the statement, it's normal to feel angry. It's even normal to feel relieved in a certain way. If we feel relieved when someone passes, that does not mean that we didn't love them. It does not mean that we don't also feel sad, but maybe there was an element of that relationship that was complicated, or maybe they were suffering and there's a relief that the suffering is ended. It's a very normal feeling. It's normal to feel lonely. It's normal to feel confused. It's normal to feel sad, to feel numb. So we want to actually say it. So if we name it and we say it, it really helps them to accept that in themselves. And just talking about it. So as this is especially applicable if somebody in your school community has passed away and it's impacting, that it's impacted the whole class. It's really helpful to have a conversation as a class. Of course, if a student is grieving on their own and they're the only person that's gone through this, having private conversations is definitely best. But if you know that lots of people are impacted, actively bringing it up in class is a really, really good idea, because there'll be some students that want to talk about it and do talk about it, and there'll be other students that do not feel comfortable talking about it at all, but will still absorb what you're saying and will get some really great insights into by just hearing the conversation. So it's a great thing to do, to bring it up if there's been some tragedy in your community, and just talk about how we feel. And you can lead that. I feel very, very sad, and I feel nervous, or I feel lonely, or I feel whatever you feel is a great way to lead that discussion. And another way that you can use your own experience is if you have lost someone. And again, whenever we're using our own experience, we always want to make sure that we have processed it ourselves. So if bringing it up makes you feel, sad or overwhelmed, or there's elements of it that are too fresh, then, obviously be conscious of that and be careful with that, and make sure that you are processing it in your own way and getting the help that you need. But as long as you feel comfortable to bring these things up, and an emotion is fine. It's just making sure that it doesn't feel like it opens something in you that feels uncontained or unprocessed. But if you have lost someone, you can bring up that experience Also, if you have experienced abandonment or you've experienced anything, that it doesn't have to be specifically losing someone to death that you've experienced. So I bring up a lot when I'm talking to young people the fact that my mom left my family when I was 16. So I experienced a loss of her. I will use that experience when I'm talking to students who have experienced a death. And it's not to say that I know how they feel, because I don't know exactly how they feel, but I do know the feeling of being left behind. So, and again, we don't have to get into a huge piece of our story, but just saying, I know what it's like to feel whatever it is that you felt in that experience can be very powerful, because this is telling them that they're not alone. And it's giving them a specific example of, hey, I went through something and this is what I felt like, as a way to open the door for them to maybe explore what they feel like in that situation too. So I want to give you just a minute to think about, if you have a specific student in mind, or if you're thinking about a hypothetical scenario in the future, just write down a sentence that you would use to be able to validate them. So it's just thinking about validation only. These are some possibilities. What is some language that you feel comfortable using? And I'll just give you a moment for that. Beautiful. Okay, we'll move on to the next step. So the next step that we're looking at in this opening of the door is looking at patterns. And so what we're trying to look at here is to help students notice how they're reacting to their grief. So remember, they're going to be confused, they're going to be overwhelmed. It's going to be really hard for them to zoom out and notice that they're in a pattern of reaction. And as we know, everything is related. So one thing impacts us, and it will sort of go down the line and impact all of the other things in our lives. So we can be so helpful to students to really gently point this out to them, what ways we might see them reacting. We have to make sure that we do this with lots of validation and very, very gently. So this is where I use a lot of we language when I'm talking to a student who has gone through something really challenging. And as I mentioned before, I will draw on my own experience a little bit to the best of my abilities, whatever I can draw on. But what we're really wanting to make sure is that when we're helping a student see a pattern of grief, there isn't a feeling of you're doing this. And we want to do that with all patterns, but especially when a student has gone through a tragedy, we really want to be as gentle as possible with it. But we can still point things out. And again, that's why I usually like to talk about myself in these situations, or use myself as an example, because I will say something like, when I experienced the experience of feeling lonely or abandoned, this is how I reacted. Can you relate to that? I will use some of that language. You don't have to do that, absolutely not. But the purpose of it is just to make it really, really gentle, to make it really soft, to make it really connected. If you already have a really close connected relationship with your students, you don't have to be quite as gentle with it. So oftentimes when I'm having interviews with students, I will have just met them. So that's where, so if you do you find yourself in a situation, and that's a good thing to reflect on too, you can have this conversation with a student that you don't know very well at all, as long as you tread carefully and slowly and softly. So examples. So you can ask about it directly. Again, you'd want to do this in private with a student, but do you want to tell me what it was like for you when that happened? Again, making it soft, making it gentle, but really showing them that you want to understand, because part of seeing patterns is breaking down what happened at first. So if it was a horrifying experience for them at first, or if it was very sudden at first, or if whatever the circumstances were of the loss, that can lead into some more insights and a conversation with them about how they're responding. If they say, well, I just came home one day and found out that they were gone, that's an opening to validate them a lot, and to then start talking about, how do you think that impacted you? So you're just trying to remember, just give them the chance to reflect on what has been impacting them, how has it impacted them, and then really just normalize their response. And so you can start that sentence and finish it with anything. It's normal when we're grieving too. Any of the above. So push people away, want people close, doubt ourselves, become aggressive. Literally anything, because with grief, remember, we're becoming overwhelmed with the feelings, or we're trying to push the feelings away. So basically, it's normal for students to do anything that when they're grieving. So, but to help them recognize, and this is the key here, what we're trying to do, help them link their behavior with their grief, because it's really hard to do that for ourselves, even as adults. It's especially hard as kids or teenagers. So something hard will have happened. They will be reacting to it, and they won't necessarily know that they've started shutting down and shutting people out, or that they've become really addicted to being on their phone, or whatever it is that you're observing. And if you can just make that link through a phrase like that, it's normal to act like that when we're grieving. That just gently helps them join the dots. Remember, you're not saying you're doing this because you're grieving. You're just saying, hey, let's just draw this parallel. I'm just going to say that it's normal. I'm not going to push it, but it really helps them to start to kind of connect those things. So I want to give you just a minute again to write down your own language. What would you say to gently point out a pattern? So if you have a student or a person in mind that you know what their pattern is, work with that. Otherwise, just do it gently. What language would you use? Maybe it's this language, maybe you tweak it a little bit. Just give you a moment for that. And it's great in this reflection too, to take a moment yourself to just reflect on which patterns that you see could be related to grief. Sometimes we don't notice them unless we stop and think about it. Oh yeah, that student is a little bit more quiet, or that student is a little bit more loud, or whatever it is, to kind of help go, oh, I wonder if that's related to their grief, because it will be on some level. All of our reactions will come, if we've gone through something like this. Okay, the last step in opening the door is connecting directly to feelings. So what we're trying to do is really help them connect, of course, to their feelings. Now, because these feelings are so complicated and so layered and so confusing, it is really hard to be in contact with them. They're so intense. It is so hard to feel the intense sadness of losing someone. So, they really need guidance and coaching and a lot of support with this, because it's hard to just be in contact with such an overwhelming feeling, especially at such a young age. And the way we can help them do that is by us being able to handle their feelings ourselves. So a lot of the time, this is the challenge, a child or a teenager will feel something and it will feel so overwhelming. And then everyone around them is also overwhelmed with the feeling and maybe gets upset themselves, or tiptoes around and doesn't want to bring it up because they're worried about upsetting that person, which is completely normal as a response. But what that does is it reinforces this student's belief that this feeling is unmanageable. Nobody can talk to me about it, or people get upset when I talk about it. And so the greatest thing we can do to help students with their feelings is bringing the feelings up or bringing the conversation up and being able to handle it, being able to sit there with them and be okay with their feeling. That really helps. It's the same thing as mirroring with an infant. So when a child is crying, we don't want to smile at them because that's invalidating for their feeling. And there's a feeling of, I'm not understood in the world. But we also don't want to, sob ourselves, because then they go, oh, this feeling is too big. Or if we react or if we get angry, what we want to do with an infant is mirror. So we show a sad face, but we also show them, hey, I can handle your sadness. Your sadness is okay for me. And that indicates to the infant that, their feelings are safe and they're okay. And this adult, this caretaker can handle them. So therefore I can handle them. It's the same thing with a grieving student. It's the same process. It's that mirroring. And so when we show them we can handle it, they see that they can handle it too. So what does that look like? Simply saying it's okay. If they are upset, if they are sad, if they are frustrated, just gently giving them that affirmation. Again, if they're doing things that are unhelpful, we don't necessarily have to say, we wouldn't say the behavior is okay, but it's okay that you feel this way. Really, really powerful. And when a student comes to you with a feeling, this is really important because it's a really hard thing to do for any of us. Instead of immediately trying to make it better or say the right thing, if we can just let the feeling be and sit with the feeling for a minute with them, that is so powerful. So they come to you and they're overwhelmed, or they're talking about something, or they're sad, just stopping for a moment and saying, let's just sit with that feeling. And you can sit with it in silence. You can just be with it. Let's just close our eyes and feel that feeling for a second. Or even just, wow, that's a big feeling. Let's just acknowledge how big that is. Like, just a moment of slowing it down is really, really powerful, because that, if they're, usually we say the feeling and then we're trying to get rid of it ourselves. So if someone else can kind of slow us down and go, yeah, this is a feeling. Let's sit with it. Let's connect to it. Let's talk about it, or let's just be with it, is very, very powerful. And then if you're talking to a group, something has happened, that's a tragedy that's impacted a lot of people, actually just actively talking about, let's explore the layers of feelings we feel. Let's talk about these feelings. That is really, really helpful. Okay, let me go back to that. Okay, let me just take a moment to just think about what language you would use that makes sense to you, or that would be in your tone of how you would bring up feelings, or how you would respond if a student had a big emotional reaction. And it's really good. I really encourage you to think through, what could I say to slow it down? Because it's the hardest thing to remember in the moment. We get flustered. We want to make it better. So just think through, what could I say, even to remind yourself to slow down with a feeling? Okay, moving on. So now we move into taking action. So the first step in taking action is helping students shift their paradigm. And so when it comes to grief, unfortunately, the number one thought that we have, which is usually buried or hidden, is that somehow it's our fault. Somehow it's my fault that this person is not here. And that is not a logical thought. But it happens especially when we're young, because we don't have a context for it. And so our brain is being really trying to be helpful and trying to figure out why. That's what our survival instinct is, always trying to figure out, why did this happen and how can I prevent this happening again? And when we're a kid, we don't have the ability to do that zoom out and understand the bigger picture and the context. And so that part of our brain that doesn't have the bigger picture will blame us because it's the only thing we can control. So if I was to blame, then maybe if I do something different, it won't happen again. That's what universally happens with grief. So the paradigm shift that we want to encourage is helping them see that they're not to blame, and helping them understand and reflect on their loss. It takes a lot to understand loss. It takes a lot of reflection to put it in context, to understand what it means for us in our lives, to understand that it doesn't have to mean that the world can't be trusted. There's a lot of things that need to go into it. And so if we can create that space to start putting those pieces together, that is really, really helpful for students. And in the case of suicides, we haven't touched on this yet, but this is sadly something that, of course, is more common than we want it to be. If a student has experienced a suicide in their life, the main focus is also helping them understand why someone would do that, why someone would take their own life. And the reason why that's so helpful is that will always be linked to blame even more. If someone close to them experiences, takes their own life, there will be always this feeling of, I should have helped, or I could have done something. This is a universal feeling. And so if we can help a student understand that somebody who takes their own life, nobody can stop that, nobody can help that, and that somebody is in a deep depression, and they're, all of the context around that, to really help them understand that it's not about them. That's the key there, because everyone will assume I didn't love them enough, or I didn't do enough, and that's tragic. So opening the door to that conversation is very helpful for students. So what does that look like? So actually just specifically saying it's not your fault. It's very simple, but it's very powerful. It's like in Good Will Hunting, that line is so powerful because it is so true. It's not your fault. So that is a really, really important thing to say. Asking the question, what do you think would cause someone to want to end their life? Again, this is very powerful if, for example, there's a suicide in your school community. To actively have this discussion with your school, with your classes, to break it down a little bit. And again, you don't need to know the answer. None of us will know the answer of why someone would do that. But just to start thinking about it, and to start students thinking about it, helps them shift out of that self-blame and into a place of more curiosity of, okay, this was going on for them. This was not my fault. And that's a really helpful process. And it also, having the conversation really helps. So sometimes we hear these awful stories where there's a suicide and then there's a copycat suicide, and it sort of keeps happening, and it's devastating. And one of the biggest reasons why that happens is that people aren't talking about it enough. And so if you just hear about something and you don't have the context and you don't process it and you don't think about it, then sure, it can trigger you. But if a student is triggered to take their own life, they were already in that state. So we can't make them do that. But one way to really counteract that is to actively talk about it, not just have it be something they heard somewhere. And again, this is the case now with how connected we all are online. Students will hear these things that might not even be in your community. So you can bring this up even if it's something that they heard about. It's a good conversation for a class to have. Wait a minute, why would this happen? Let's really talk about it, so that we can really understand how serious it is, and how low someone is to be in that state, and how just all of those factors of it. And finally, again, a student has to be ready for this, but we can start, this is part of them understanding and contextualizing it. We can ask questions like, are there any ways that you're still connected to them? So again, everybody has different spiritual faiths, everybody has different ways of thinking about death. But if you can help them start to think about, even though they're gone, there are ways that I can stay connected to them through their memories. If they can start to, that's a paradigm shift to think, oh, if they're gone, it means I can never access them again, versus there's maybe ways that I could be connected to them. So again, you want to do that after you've done all of the other processing, but it is a really nice paradigm shift to introduce. Oh, sorry, let you take a second. So take a minute here and just think about, what language would you use to try to introduce a paradigm shift? So you could think about someone in particular, you could think about, a hypothetical situation, but what language seems natural to you that would help just encourage a bit of a shift in thinking? Okay. Now, the next step in terms of taking action is reminding students of their own power. So before we get to the step of actually doing something to help ourselves, we have to remember that we can. So a lot of students will forget that they have the power to do these things. So it's really helpful to, before we suggest a skill, do a little bit of this reminding of, of courage, so that we can help them see that they do have what it takes to help themselves. So one of the things we're trying to help them understand is that they have the ability to feel their own pain, because that's something that is really hard to understand when you're deep in grief. And so just reminding them, whether that's through examples or what you've seen or things they've been through in the past, that's really, really helpful to remind them of that, because grief shakes us. And they'll question everything about themselves and about their abilities. Also helping them see their ability to help themselves cope and thrive. So we can feel our pain on the one hand, and we can help ourselves with it. And those two things kind of go hand in hand. So again, pointing out situations they've been through before, or the skills or the resilience that you see in them, that's really helpful. And also helping them remember their power to connect internally with people they've lost. So helping them remember that they have memories, they have maybe an intuitive sense, if you've seen that in them. They have the ability to love someone who isn't there, and these things are very powerful and very, very helpful when we're grieving. So examples. Just pointing out to them, feeling all of this takes incredible strength and courage. So a really helpful, framing, if you're talking to a student about their grief, just naming it. Hey, this is amazing that you're talking to me about this. And then asking, is there anything you've done in the past to help with these feelings? So, just again, you don't have to be the one that fixes it for them, but reminding hey, think about what you might already have access to. And then asking them specifically, do you have ways that you connect to their memory when you're sad? And this is actually something I use a lot with students, when young students, when they have separation anxiety. They do go through a little mini experience of grief. And so helping them, oh, do you have a teddy bear that reminds you? And you can, and again, if it's that kind of a situation, you can work with their parents with that too. But just, do you have ways that you connect to their memory? Because it can remind them, especially this is a student who's really, really overwhelmed. You can remind them of these things that they have access to. So I want to give you a moment just to think about, what language would you use to remind a student of their brilliance, of their power, of their courage, of their strength, before you move on to the skills. Okay, and then the last piece is the skills. Again, this is usually the thing we jump to first. So moving through all of those stages before, or even some of them, is really, really helpful before we jump in. But then there are skills. There are things students can do to help themselves with grief. So we want to help them practice acknowledging their feelings. This is a skill that really needs to be practiced. Help them practice self-soothing, and help them connecting to the memory of the person they lost. These are the 3 core skills that we really want to be encouraging in anyone that has lost someone. So some examples. So simply helping them in the moment, are you able to let those feelings out? And there's lots of different ways that students can let their feelings out. It can be physical, it can be through art, it can be talking about it can be punching something, but just encouraging them, what can you do right now to let those feelings out? And then you can actually do something with them. So let's try something that might help us take care of these feelings. So again, if you're talking to a group, this can be done in a group setting. If you're just talking to one person, do something with them. Again, joining them in it is a really helpful way of scaffolding. So even if this is an older student and you might imagine that they have skills around, soothing already, grief is a whole other ball game. So they will probably need to be taken back to the beginning again. They need to be walked through that path. So doing something with them is very, very helpful and powerful. And then you can actually ask them again, if they're feeling open to it and you have that connection with them and you've talked about these other pieces, you can ask directly, tell me about your grandma. What did you love about them? Or tell me about whoever it is that they lost. That will really help them. Your interest in that person will help them build the skill. Talking to you about it will help them connect. And so this is another really powerful thing that we can do is ask directly about it. Again, it's something that we often shy away from because we're worried about upsetting them. But if you take those other steps first, then this, it's logical to move on to this. And so that's the piece. If you're feeling that hesitation of, I don't want to bring this up, it's only because, there's probably some feelings that are there, but you just help them process them. You talk about the feelings, you validate them. And then by the time you get here, it becomes a natural, lighter element to the conversation. So just take a moment to think about what language you would use, what skill you think would be the most useful in your personal context when you're thinking about a grieving student or person. And then finally, just to wrap it up, we went through the 6 steps in terms of the different sort of ways you can have these conversations. They do go in order, they build on each other, but you can also dip into any of them at any time. So every single interaction counts. If you just have a moment with a student and you just can validate them, or you just, name their feeling, or you just even, help them with a skill, it doesn't matter. There's no right way to do this. The goal here is for you to have that confidence to know you can bring it up, and that giving them the space and acknowledging what they're going through, even if they get upset, that's okay. This is a very, very upsetting situation. So getting upset is not an indication that it's not a conversation that should be had. It's just an indication that they probably need a lot of gentleness and encouragement and safeness to have the conversation. So I really encourage you to upskill your team, really make sure that everyone in your school community knows the importance of creating that safe space and how they can create that safe space for a student who's grieving. Wonderful. Thank you. I will stop sharing. If anyone has any questions, happy to answer them. And also, if you want to submit them after, we can also answer them later if you don't want to ask here. But thank you for paying attention to this really, really important subject. I really appreciate it.